Hi, this is Hannah with French Faire, and today we're working on a French buffet using layers of Toscana milk paint from Amy Howard Home. By doing some prep work. We're going to remove all of the hardware, and then we're going to give it a scuff sand over the entire piece and all of the drawers. Then when we're done, we're going to clean it down with clean slate. This makes sure that we have an extra clean surface to work with before we apply our first layer of paint. For my first layer on this piece, I'm going to be using One Step Paint in Vintage Affliction. This is a beautiful blue color, and I'm excited to get to use it with layers of Toscana milk paint. I am not one that gravitates towards bright colors on a regular basis, but I'm going to show you how I use this paired with some neutrals and layers for a layered look that has hints of bright color. I'm going to apply 2 layers of my base color with a synthetic brush. You can use a chip brush if that's what you prefer. I'm only doing 2 layers because I don't think it needs to be perfect. I'm going to have a ton of different layers on this piece, and this is just step number 1. Before we go in with our next step, I want to take a second and talk about layers. When you're approaching a project like this, whether it be with cracked patina or Toscana milk paint, or just regular layers of one-step paint or chalk paint, it's important to consider what you're putting down first versus what you're putting down last. What you're putting down first is what you're going to see the least of, and what you put down last is what you're going to see the most of. So this project, I know I only want to see little hints of this blue when we're all said and done with all of our layers. I want to see that peeking through my layers of Toscana milk paint, so I went ahead and used this first. First is what we're going to see the least of. Now next I'm going to use some gold leaf. I want to see hints of that gold leaf peeking through the Toscana milk paint rather than having to put that gold leaf on top of the milk paint when we're all said and done with all of our layers. So when you're approaching a project like this and you're trying to figure out all your different layers and how to achieve that layered, textured look with colors peeking through or golds peeking through, consider what you want to see the least of and consider what you want to see the most of, and try and build your layers that way. So I'm going to go ahead and start applying some of my gold leaf. I am using gilding size, which is basically just an adhesive that comes with the gold leaf sheets from Amy Howard Home. I've just poured mine into a small container so it's easier to work with. And I've got a couple different artist brushes, just small brushes, and I'm going to apply this gilding size to the areas that I want that gold leaf to stick to. I'm applying my gold leaf sheets by applying the sheets directly to the gilding size that I put down on just the ridges where I want to see that gold. I'm applying the sheets once the gilding size has become a little bit tacky, and then once I've applied all of my sheets, I'm brushing away the excess with a chip brush. we're done with our gold leaf, we're ready to mix up our cracked gesso. This is a 1-to-1 mixture, just like Toscana milk paint. So I'm going to show you how we mix that. I'm just going to take a scoop of my cracked gesso. And I'm just using an old Tupperware. Anything you have to mix in is totally fine. And then it's 1 part warm water. Not hot water, but warm water. And then I just mix this with a brush. I feel like it mixes a little bit better with a brush versus a stir stick. And this does take a little bit more finessing to mix all the way together than milk paint does. So just mix it for a little while. And this should be kind of the consistency of pancake batter when you're done mixing. I like to let mine sit for a little bit before I start applying it. So I'm just going to go ahead and let this sit for maybe 10 minutes and then I'll show you how to apply it. Okay, so I have my cracked gesso mixed. I've let this sit for about 10 minutes. So I'm just going to start applying this all over the entire piece. I am going to not put this on top of my gold leaf. You could if you wanted to. You could also apply your cracked gesso before you put on your gold leaf. I'm just choosing for the layers that I want. When I pull back my milk paint to this gold leaf, I want to see that blue versus the white that the cracked gesso gives you. So I'm just going to go ahead and start applying this. And cracked gesso is watery. It's just going to be that way. It's totally normal. It's kind of funny to play with, but it gives a really beautiful, authentic crack to your Toscana milk paint when layered. So I'm just going to do this with a small brush so that I can avoid this gold leaf, and then I will use a bigger brush for the rest of my piece. Cracked gesso is a really great way to get an authentic, aged, cracking finish with your Toscana milk paint. Cracked gesso is designed to work with your Toscana milk paint, kind of the same way that cracked patina is designed to work with one-step paint. Cracked gesso will give you more of a fissure crack versus cracked patina gives you a heavier, thicker, kind of peeling crack. I like using cracked gesso because it gives a white layer to my piece, also giving that authentic crack. Ready to mix up our first color of milk paint. I'm going to be using Scandinavian Gray, and I'm going to show you how to mix that. You're going to need some warm water, a couple bowls or Tupperwares, anything to mix in, a small artist brush to stir with, and a paint strainer or some cheesecloth. Either will work just fine. So to mix our milk paint, we're going to take 1 part of our powder with 1 part warm water, just like we did with cracked gesso. So I'm just going to scoop this out with a measuring spoon. Place it into our Tupperware. And I'm going to do 2 scoops for this because I'm working on a larger project. I like to just mix as much as I need per project. So if you're working on something smaller, mix a little bit less. And then we're going to measure out equal parts warm water. And use warm water, not hot water. It will mix together a little bit better if you use warm water versus just room temp or cold. And then I just mix this with an artist brush. I feel as though it mixes a little bit better when you do it that way versus a stir stick. And this is going to be really watery. Milk paint is watery. And I just try and mix this till all of the big clumps are gone. I am going to strain this into a different container. It goes on a little bit better if you take the time to strain it. And once that is mostly mixed, I'm going to take a paint strainer, and you can totally use cheesecloth as well. And we're just going to run this through, and then it'll be ready to use. So once we've mixed our milk paint, we're gonna start applying this. I'm using a natural bristle brush. You can use a chip brush. You can use a synthetic brush if that's what you prefer. Something to note about milk paint is when it's mixed and it's in its wet format, it is gonna be quite a bit darker than how it looks in the package, but it will dry down to the color that you see in the package. So if it looks super dark when you're applying it, don't be alarmed, totally normal. So I'm just gonna go ahead and start applying this, and I am gonna apply this all over this entire piece. There is no secret method or crazy tip to how to apply this on a not flat surface. All I do with this is apply it all over the same way that you would on a flat surface, but be really mindful of drips and don't do your first coat on a vertical surface and then walk away. I try to just do my coat slowly and kind of babysit it, catch any of those drips if you see them, because you will. It's not ideal to do this on a vertical surface, but most pieces of furniture like this buffet, I don't want to have to tip this on weird sides every time I need to do a different coat. That would just take twice as long to get this thing done. So I'm just going to apply this while it's upright and just be really mindful of when I'm applying it that I'm catching any of those drips as we go. And try to work in sections. So I'm going to do like this section, then I'll move on to this section, just to kind of be mindful. And I am going over this gold leaf this time, because I want to be able to see that underneath these layers of milk paint. And if you have to do a couple different thin layers since you're working on a vertical surface, that's okay too. This stuff is really buildable. I'm going to be doing different layers of a couple different grays. You can do a couple different layers of the same color if you find that that's a better application for you. This stuff is very forgiving, so you can just sit here and watch for these drifts and kind of catch them and smooth them out as you go. It will dry pretty quick because it's so watery, so just again, be mindful, work in sections. There is absolutely no secret to doing this. It is just being patient and kind of keeping an eye on things. And as I'm moving on to work on this section in the middle, I am still kind of checking and looking back to this section over here to make sure that we don't have any crazy drips going on. So I'm just going to go through and apply this to the entire thing the same way, and the top and the drawers, and then we'll wait for this to dry for about 30 minutes, maybe a little longer. Totally will depend on your temperature and your space or your shop. And then once this is dry, we'll go in with our next layer. Once our first layer of Scandinavian gray is dry, we're going to move on to a second layer of milk paint. I'm going to be using Marsh Gray. This is a really pretty light neutral gray color, similar to Scandinavian gray, but with a little bit more of a warmer undertone. So I'm going to layer these together, and we're going to mix this the exact same way that we did with our Scandinavian gray, and we're going to apply it the same way with a chip brush. Once our final layer of milk paint is dry, we're ready to move on to antique glaze. You're gonna need just a couple things for this. It's already ready to go in the container that it comes in, so you don't need any mixing. You are gonna place your antique glaze into a bowl or Tupperware, whatever you have. Something big enough to fit a sea sponge in, because that's what we're gonna use to apply this. So I usually like to have a couple different ones on hand. And then a bowl of clean water, because when we apply our antique glaze, we're actually gonna be removing some of our milk paint, and we're gonna wanna clean off our sponge in some water before we keep dipping it into our clean antique glaze. So we're gonna show you how we apply this on both a vertical surface and a horizontal surface. Okay, so while we're waiting for the rest of our piece to dry, I'm gonna show you how I do antique glaze on a flat surface on one of these drawers. So we have our antique glaze in our bowl. I'm gonna take a sea sponge and dunk it into our antique glaze and really saturate it, and then kind of wring out a little bit of the excess. Now for this finish, I'm gonna apply this all over to the entire thing. I really wanna start removing some of this milk paint to show that blue vintage affliction that we have from our first layer. So I'm gonna start dabbing this all over. Antique glaze is really like the magic potion for milk paint. And it can be used just a little bit or a lot. You can apply it with a rag, with a sea sponge. It's really fun to play with and really creates those depths of layers. So you can see here, I've just applied it all over. We've got some pooling in certain areas here. That's okay. That's gonna start to remove some of these layers of milk paint, which is exactly what I want. So I just really wanna make sure this entire thing is really saturated. And then I'm gonna take a clean sea sponge, not one that we've put in antique glaze, not one that's dry, just wet down a little bit with water. And I'm gonna start to pull at this milk paint. This is what will start to show those layers underneath. And I'm gonna go over and saturate this again. Antique glaze is something that I think you really just have to spend some time playing with to decide how you like to use it. Different finishes, you can use it different ways. You can apply just a little bit of it and remove slight layers of your milk paint. You can remove a little bit more like we're doing here. It's really a fun product to play with. So we're starting to see some of this blue that we have under there, the vintage affliction. And for now, I'm gonna call that good, and I'm gonna leave this. We're gonna let it dry completely. This will take a bit longer to dry than milk paint. So you'll be able to tell when it's completely dry, the colors will even out. And these dark areas that look like how our milk paint does when it's wet will dry to the colors that you see in the package. So we're gonna let this completely dry, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like dried down, and we can determine whether we wanna do more antique glaze or leave it just how it is. So now that our entire piece is dry, we're ready to do our antique glaze on this part. So same process that we did on the drawer, but have to do this with a bit more patience and a little bit more attention to all of those drips. There's no science or weird secrets on how to do this. It's just patience and being mindful of all of those drips. So same as before, I'm gonna saturate my sponge in this antique glaze, and I am gonna start applying it all over. And definitely work in sections when you're doing this on a vertical surface. See, we've got all these drips already starting to happen. That is just going to be the case, and you just need to be mindful about it. You can wring out a little more excess when you're doing it on a vertical surface. That makes it a little easier to work with. But still got to be pretty mindful. So I'm going to take this dryer sponge and kind of just soak up a little bit of that excess so I don't have to worry about glaze just about dry on this entire piece. So you can see we've got some of this blue of the Vintage Afflictions showing through, some of that gray from the Scandinavian gray, and then on top we have that Marsh gray, which is really more kind of like an off-white color. So at this point you can choose to leave this as is, or you can go back over it with another layer of antique glaze. That's what I'm going to choose to do for this. I want to pull a little bit more of that paint off of this gold leaf. I like that there's only little hints of this blue, but I do want to kind of add a couple little areas to this, kind of on the bottom here and some more up here. So we're going to do the exact same process with our antique glaze and a sea sponge and a rag or another sea sponge to really kind of start to remove some of that. And that will be probably enough for this piece. I'm going to be applying some layers of wax. I'm going to be using light wax and dark wax from Amy Howard Home. I'm going to start with my light wax and I'm going to apply that all over this entire piece with a chip brush. Once I've coated the entire piece with light wax, I'm going to add some little details of dark wax on the edges and in those ridges and crevices, just for a little bit of extra dimension. I'm applying both of these colors with different chip brushes, offloading the excess on my brush before I apply it onto my piece. Adding the wax to your piece really brings back that depth and dimension from all of those layers that we put down over the course of doing this piece. Once I'm done with adding the wax, I'm going to wait for it to come to tap, and I'm going to buff it out to a sheen to finish it off. Thanks everybody for watching. I really enjoyed making this finish. If you guys have any questions or comments about how I did this, leave them below. I look forward to seeing you guys next week.